Good afternoon, folks. So what I want to do this afternoon is just give you a bit of a background on what's going on in Wales. So this is about our aspirations for sustainable drainage. I'm planning to give you a bit of an outline of the Welsh legislative context, trying to contrast and compare that with what goes on in England and elsewhere. Talk about the SUD standards that we introduced in Wales last year. And then something a little bit more topical on evidence around costs and benefits for SUDs, which we're going to be using to inform our policy as we go forward, and then talking about those next steps as we go forward. So let's dive in, shall we? Much of what we have in the way of legislation in Wales is a shared legacy from joint England and Wales legislation for many years in the past. So things like the Water Industry Act is common in England and Wales. But drainage, along with a number of other areas, is now a devolved matter in Wales. So although this is our legacy, this is the background, there's no reason why we need to follow the same path as England anymore. Back in about 2008, 2009, we were looking at we were working very closely with DEFRA and the Environment Agency, in fact that's where I was at the time, how we could try and take forward SUDs in a way that would ensure that it was the preferred option, it was the required option for new developments. And the thinking behind that led eventually, following a consultation and lots of discussions, to the Flood and Water Management Act of 2010. Which received cross-party support and introduced a mechanism for approval and adoption and design and so on for sustainable drainage. So that's a common background for England and Wales. But that legislation has sat on the statute book, so to speak, without being put into use in either England or Wales, and I won't talk about what's gone on in England. We decided back in 2011 not to take it forward at that time because we wanted to be very clear about funding for maintenance. So it's been in the long grass for a while. More recently though, we had some legislation passed in Wales called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And this puts a duty on all public bodies and the Welsh Government to take a look at what we're doing in terms of policy and make sure that it delivers to a much wider range of policy objectives. So, for example, we have goals relating to health, relating to development of children, relating to the Welsh language. So it's not just about the usual flood risk management in this context. And that means that plays into the strength of sustainable drainage, because it starts, when you're looking at sustainable drainage, you start to look at multiple benefits. You're not just focusing on quantity and quality of water, but you're looking at the other things that you can bring along with that. And it's against the background of the Wellbeing of Future Generations legislation that we're starting to see a way forward for sustainable drainage. And indeed, our water strategy, which we published nearly 2 years ago now, flagged up the intention to look very carefully at how we might take forward a policy in Wales that ensures that sustainable drainage is the preferred option for all new development. Now, I'm very careful in what I'm talking about today. I'm talking about new development. Fergus will be giving you an example of what's happened when you start to look at retrofit, and I'm very conscious of the balance between the proportion of buildings that are already there and those that need retrofit and what we're doing as new developments. But we need to start by making sure that we're not building up a legacy of problems into the future from what we're building now. So as an initial step on the path to shall we say, a more rigid approach to sustainable drainage in Wales, we worked with HR Wallingford and a number of stakeholders about 2 years, 1 year ago, to take the standards for sustainable drainage which had been developed for use with the Flood and Water Management Act in England and Wales, and to turn them into a set of standards that we felt delivered against our objectives in Wales. We published these voluntary standards in 2016, January, just over a year ago, and they outline a set of principles for sustainable drainage and a set of 6 standards They're accompanied by some quite detailed guidance on how you might achieve those standards, and they provide links to other sources of information. For example, they rely quite heavily on the Suds manual, which we'll reference later on. So the intention was that the voluntary standards would, if you like, be a mark in the sand and say, this is where we, as Welsh Government, see the future for sustainable drainage. We're putting these down now for people to trial, so for developers, local authorities to look at and see how they could make them work. And it was on the basis that if we give it a trial for a year, 2 years, then maybe when we come to the point where we're looking at statutory standards for sustainable drainage, we can have some feedback from users and we can make sure that the statutory standards are the best we can possibly make them. But some of the key things that sit behind our standards is back to the point I made earlier on, and that is making sure that when you're looking at the design of the surface water drainage for development, you aim for multiple benefits, whether they are about amenity, whether they're about biodiversity, whether they're about improving water quality. The idea is that you don't just focus on one aspect of the design of your surface water drainage system. So you need to protect the water quality that's coming from your site. You need to protect downstream water quality. You need to make sure, of course, that you're managing the volume and runoff rate of the surface water that's coming off the site. But you also need to see if there's any opportunities to deliver some benefits for biodiversity. And ultimately, what we're looking for is to make our new developments a better place to live, somewhere attractive, somewhere that our people will want to live, rather than building yet more areas where people are just going to want to stay there for a short time and move on, a stepping stone in their housing career. So, the Suds standards really push quite hard the fact that it's a natural approach to managing surface water, which is trying to mimic the natural processes. For those of you that have worked on sustainable drainage for any length of time, this is motherhood and apple pie, but it's quite important to make it clear that this is what we're trying to aim for, and that we should be trying to address those quality, quantity, amenity and biodiversity objectives on an equal footing. That doesn't mean that every scheme will deliver to all of those, but it does mean that you should be assessing the scheme and measuring it up against those principles. And we expect there to be a very wide range of techniques that you can use, whether it's permeable paving, ponds, wetlands, you may need pipes, there's all sorts of things you can use. We don't rule out techniques. We don't rule out drainage techniques. What we say is that you need to merge them into a scheme that will drain the development in a way that meets the principles and objectives of our Suds standards. So the standards, as I said, go through a set of principles, which I'll outline in a bit more detail in a moment. There's a hierarchy for destination, so that's a fairly obvious thing. You know, if you can infiltrate, then you use infiltration, and the very lowest level of discharges to combined sewer. Then there's a series of fixed standards which deal with things like biodiversity, amenity. There's design criteria to try and make sure that what you're designing is something that actually will be constructible and maintainable into the future. And again, just to emphasise, much of what we are saying links back to the advice and guidance that's available for people in the Suds manual. So the key principles we pick up in our standards are managing water on the surface and close to source. So that's really an aspiration that we want people to try and deliver against. Maximising the benefits, sorry, can't repeat it too often, but needing to make sure that you pick up the multiple benefits you can. So here we've got a site in Cambridgeshire actually where they've got a kids playing area that actually doubles up as a flood area if and when there's excess rain. Try to make sure you get the most out of your drainage system. It should be future-proof, so you need to make sure that you're taking account of things like the potential changes we anticipate with climate change and population change as well. It needs to make sure that the system is designed to prevent pollution, and it should be trying to use what's known as the Suds management train, so a series of Suds techniques used one after the other, rather than, sadly, what I see all too often, which is a conventional drainage system with a pond at the end. So it's really important that we try and manage water through the system rather than just at the end. we recognised in Wales that the voluntary standards on their own were not going to be enough, and Ian will speak about this later on. But developers, when we first published the voluntary standards, came to local authorities and said, well, what can we do to deliver against these standards? And then they soon realised that actually the standards were voluntary, so they kind of, okay, well, that's fine, you've done those, we don't need to take any notice of those because they're voluntary. So we do need to look at a way of taking this forward, and we probably need to put those standards onto a statutory footing if we want to make sure that we improve uptake of sustainable drainage. All the studies that you will ever see on sustainable drainage will say to you that maintenance and adoption is one of the key barriers to uptake. And indeed, that was behind the thinking that introduced the Flood and Water Management Act in 2010. That act was aimed at tackling those issues of maintenance adoption. But we also think it's very important that planning plays its part in making sure that SUDs are taken on board right from the earliest stages of a development, when developers are looking at purchasing the land and when they're first thinking about layout. So planning has a crucial part to play in ensuring that the drainage design is integrated with the whole design of the site, rather than being an add-on extra, as it so often is. If we are going to take forward some sort of statutory footing for sustainable drainage in Wales, we do need to have good evidence to support the way we're going. We identified this a long time ago. Last year we put out a contract for an organisation called EPC to do some work for Welsh Government to inform our future policy. And we asked them to compare SUDS drainage systems with standard drainage, to look at the performance of those SUDS systems, preferably with time, to look at the costs. It's a real challenge, as you can imagine, because you're trying to get people to look at costs of a single scheme using conventional and SUDS drainage, and it's almost impossible to get a direct comparator between the two. We asked them to look at the benefits, and particularly to focus on the wider benefits that we would have as an expectation with the implementation of the future generations legislation. So we are focusing on those benefits above and beyond the conventional benefits in terms of hydraulic controls and water quality controls. And we asked them to consider the legislative context. So they started doing that work towards the end of last year, and the approach they took was to trawl around the UK, Europe and the rest of the world for some case studies that they could use as a basis for their work. And in the end they came up with 34 case studies which they delved into then in some detail to look at the costs and benefits. They also interviewed quite a number of key stakeholders in Wales about where they saw the problems with sustainable drainage and what they saw were the needs in order to implement a better uptake of SUDs in Wales. And I suspect there's one or two people in the room that were actually interviewed as part of that process. They also looked at a wide range of additional evidence in terms of issues around adoption, maintenance and funding. They looked almost wherever they could find information to support the work they were doing. But ultimately, it came down to an economic analysis, because that's probably going to be one of the key factors in terms of taking forward the legislation. So they delivered the report to us about 2 weeks ago. We managed to get it onto our website on Friday. And there is an executive summary and the full report available on our Welsh Government website, which I didn't have the address for when I did this, but I have now. But if you search on either on the Welsh Government website or even on Google, if you put Welsh Government and SUDS, you will come up with the SUDS standards, and the same page contains the executive summary and the report in full at the bottom of the page if you go down. But the key findings were quite interesting. They said that, looking at what goes on in Wales, SUDs are already in use on many sites. But they said actually what you see is of really variable quality and probably wouldn't match up very well with the standards, the voluntary standards we published last year. Quite often the SUDs are underground. They're what we call hard SUDs. They're not taking opportunities for landscaping, for biodiversity, amenity. They're not delivering against the multiple benefits measure that we ask for in the standards. Surprisingly, no, not surprisingly, they identified that key barriers to greater uptake and better standards in sustainable drainage were to do with the maintenance and operational issues and the fact that there was no one who was going to step forward and adopt these systems. But there were some very important key messages that came out of their studies, and that was, although the costs of a SUDS solution for a new development can be variable, they were always lower than a conventional drainage system. And I emphasise the word always, because that wasn't quite what I expected. And there may be some caveats in the report, but the key message here is that actually you will save money if you go down a well-designed SUDS route right from the start of the development. And they put some figures around that, which you will see in the report. Their estimate is you could save up to around £9,000 per plot in terms of the cost of drainage for new housing developments. And the benefits, if you monetise them, would be of the order of £300 per plot per year. So there's some, when you start to add that up against 110,000 proposed new homes in Wales by 2021, that starts to look like quite a big benefit to be had purely from an economic point of view. And if you have a government who's really keen to make sure that there are sufficient houses for the population, something that enables you to build more houses for the same money surely has to be something you need to be looking at. So the key recommendations of this report, because it was a report for and to Welsh Government, were that we needed to sort out adoption and maintenance. And basically they said that implementing Schedule 3 was a good start, but it wasn't everything that would be needed. But that would be a good way forward. We really do need to nail down the issue of sustainable funding. So how do we make sure that local authorities do have the money to manage and maintain these SUD systems into the future? They called for a register of sustainable drainage systems, which I have a feeling is one of the requirements that sits in amongst the stuff in Schedule 3. So if we implement Schedule 3, we should be well on the way to doing that. We need to do some work to persuade people that SUDs are assets rather than liabilities. A lot of local authorities at the moment, all over the country, whether it's England or Wales, are looking at ways of saving money, and they're looking at things like green space and parks as being a liability rather than an asset. And the difference is that in Wales, those local authorities have a duty under the Future Generations legislation to look at the well-being of our future generations, and they need to actually reassess their attitudes to green space, and that's something we'll be going back to them fairly hard on in the next few months. And they also suggested that we should be organising something like a SUD summit to bring together key stakeholders in Wales to thrash out how we take this forward. Fergus, this is the picture of one of the sites in Llanelli, so this is a retrofit, it's not new build. But Fergus will be talking more about the site in Llanelli later on. Well, it's the same place. So finally then, to move on to the next steps for us in Wales, we've just had approval from our Minister to develop a consultation package, so we're in the process of doing that. In the first place, we're looking at all the possible options to take SUDS forward, but it's likely that this will boil down to three options, and one of them will be the do-nothing option. One will be implementing Schedule 3. Do we need to tweak it to make it work for Wales? And one will be a sort of, me too sort of thing, and see if we can make planning deliver. But we've learned from what's happened in other parts of the UK about whether planning delivers SUDS. So we have learnt by looking at what goes on in Scotland about what happens if you make it entirely a water company responsibility, and we've learnt by looking elsewhere about how well planning delivers this for us. So we're likely to put forward Schedule 3 implementation as being our preferred option. We are undertaking an impact assessment, so we've got somebody right now developing an impact assessment which will go alongside the consultation document. And we're looking really hard now at the funding options to make sure that when we take this forward, we are very clear about how it will be funded. Bob, I mentioned to Bob Bray earlier on that I would have a picture here from one of his sites, and it's a very old picture of a school that Bob will be able to recognise. Yeah. Yeah. So our next steps now will be to work with our stakeholders, and in particular we've got a SUDS advisory group that we've set up, which brings together a bunch of people from local authorities and so on in Wales, to review our standards that we published last year, to develop a process map so that people can see how it is they can move from, if you like, concept of a development through to having a sustainable drainage system designed, checked, approved and adopted. And it's not dissimilar to the sort of process map that a water company has, for example, to deal with adoption of sewers. We're continuing to gather evidence, and if you like, this is a plea, if you've got any evidence that will be helpful in terms of costs and comparable costs of new developments, then please let us know. It doesn't matter whether it's not in Wales. And we will be asking questions about whether or not we need to make changes to Schedule 3. And one possible problem for us with Schedule 3 is it defines sustainable drainage as being those drainage systems which cannot be adopted by the sewerage undertaker, and it seems like the sewerage undertakers might be changing the basis for that as we speak. So we'll have to come back to that. So to conclude then, I just want to say that I've tried to explain the Welsh legislative context, both its similarities with what goes on in England and its differences, and in particular the strength of our future generations legislation in driving us to look at a much wider range of benefits than just the hydraulic ones. I've talked about the voluntary SUD standards in Wales. I've probably said more than I should have said about those, but they're really important because they encompass those multiple benefits. I've talked a little bit about the evidence around cost and benefits and the recent report we've had from EPC, and about the next steps in terms of a consultation, which we are hoping will be out by the middle of the year. And my thanks to the graffiti artist in Swindon who provided me with the final shot there. So Peter, I hope that's more or less to time for you. Thank you.